got several slides. I'll try and get through them within 25 minutes. And I've interspersed a few factual slides in with the photos that I've taken, that I took. So to go on with this, I went to Palestine for the first time ever last year in the summertime. I was fortunate enough to have a host family that I stayed with, some friends there, in a city that probably many of you know, called Hebron, in the south of the West Bank. And I'm going to go through in two halves basically, so that we've called this talk Occupation Meets Resistance. The signs of occupation that are obvious, evident for all to see if you go there, that I've taken some photos to give examples of, and then in the second half more about the resistance, as in the local population, how are they resisting this obvious occupation. So I'll carry on as quick as I can so I can get through them. Just to outline, hopefully you can see, you probably can't read the names there, but that's the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which together make up the occupied Palestinian territories. I stayed here in Hebron, as I mentioned, just outside it, actually, in a village. Bethlehem, which is where I kind of arrived when I got there, through Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and then was taken down here. And I visited two other places of significance. I mean, I did go to Jericho briefly, but there's Ramallah, which is where the Palestinian Authority is, and Nablus, which is a Palestinian city in the north. Very interesting place to see. So, as I say, the first half more about the occupation itself. Walls and watchtowers. Took lots of photos of these. So most of you have probably seen these kind of things before, but it's really amazing to see firsthand. Different types of, I call them illegal colony. I'm going to justify those with the international law and so on in the next few slides, so bear with me on that. Settlements is the more international term, obviously. Hebron, particularly in the centre of Hebron city, which is an interesting case all of its own. And when I was staying in the village outside of there, there's a few photos I took of importance. Then Nablus, that city in the north, which there's at least one refugee camp there. Not all of you may know, but a lot of the West Bank cities have also got refugee camps with either within them or surrounding them, effectively from 1948, when the Nakba, which was the ethnic cleansing of that area, happened. Some of them were internally displaced and remain to this day refugees within that the West Bank area still, not just the surrounding countries. And also Bedouin villages, you could say, saw evidence of those, which was interesting as well to see. On to the second half, resistance, the wall, again, but more images of, more painting, artwork that's on the wall in terms of the images of resistance. You can still hear me okay? Back?
Yeah.
Again, Hebron, but focusing on one particular non-governmental organisation, NGO, called Youth Against Settlements, who I was lucky enough to go and chat with when I was there, and see some photos of that. Ramallah, particularly the Yasser Arafat Museum, which was new a year or two ago, brand spanking new, amazing place. So outside Hebron, again, there's the wall, but in a different context to what I'll show you on the previous slides, in a more rural area. And then eventually leaving via Israel, some interesting photos to note there, and before we finish. So going swiftly on to the wall, to give a bit of background information as a recap, or if you don't know about this, it was started, it's also called the Israeli West Bank Barrier, which is a more accurate term really, because most of it is not wall, it's actually triple layered fencing. But it started being built in 2002 and was almost completed, I believe, in 2014. It still hasn't been completely finished, but about 700 kilometres long in total. That's just the West Bank, and it's amounts to the total length amounts to double the length roughly of the internationally recognised Green Line, which is the 1949 armistice line, because it weaves around not into Israeli territory but into Palestinian territory in the West Bank, sometimes going 20 kilometres inside the West Bank, thereby annexing roughly, as you'll see, about 10% of the West Bank land. It's 8 metres high, with sometimes 2 or 3 metres of extra razor wire on top, making it an enormous 11 metres tall. 85% of it runs deep, sometimes deep into Palestinian territory, and thereby annexing 10%. 15% runs, of course, the rest of it runs along the border. Then in about the international law on this, briefly, the UN stated that the wall contradicts international law and should be removed. That was voted by overwhelming majority of countries. Humanitarian impact. So it severely, obviously, restricts their movement, not just going to Israel, the Palestine West Bank into Israel, but also within, between Palestinian communities within the West Bank. Travel and commuting to work. A lot of Palestinians, I guess more before the wall, they used to work in Israel, so that's cut off a lot of income that they could make. And roughly 55,000 Palestinians cross it each year legally, and roughly the same amount, estimate, cross it illegally. So the question is, is it really for security? 90, obviously, vast majority don't perform terrorist acts in Israel of those who cross the wall. So is it for security? Okay, so this is my first picture that I took while I was there on this slide. You can see for yourselves military watch towers looking over in many places. And again, and along the wall. So sometimes they're in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes they're actually attached to the wall, being watched. This was, I think, the outskirts of Bethlehem. And inside Bethlehem, you have huge mammoth wall. That's me there with my kufiya on, the traditional Arabic Palestinian scarf. And you may be able to see there's an exhibition, if you like, posters which stretch a long way along the wall, and they're talking about mainly personal stories and from the local people. It would be great to spend a lot more time there. I only had a short time, unfortunately. This is just to give some perspective of the same wall in the same area. And again, you can see the wall. This is not Bethlehem, Abadis, which is near Jerusalem, say next to, because it is basically almost a suburb of Jerusalem, and obviously the wall basically then cut it off overnight to the main city. and presumably source of revenue for that suburb or town. So it's pretty stark when you see it. There's a university where there's a lot of activism and protest just behind where we're looking, and that's the wall area near there, and there's signs of obviously the partial damage to the wall from those protests. They've all been crushed since then by the Palestinian Authority, I presume. Okay, going on to the settlements, or as I call them, colonies, for Jewish Israelis only, within the West Bank. They are Jewish only, so just to run through the basic facts about it, since 1967 they started being built in the West Bank on internationally agreed Palestinian land. Around 500 of them, there's around 500 of them in the West Bank, with a further 100 that aren't recognised, so-called outposts, and I'll talk about that more with the pictures. Total population of settlers approximately 800,000 inside the West Bank, which are served, all of these 500 or 600 settlements are served very well by infrastructure, Israeli infrastructure, roads, and utilities, amenities, and so on. And that includes the unrecognised outposts, which I'll go on to, as I say. To give some perspective, so obviously they started being built in 1967, the first one, and then roughly 5 of them are big ones. First one here, Ma'ale Adumim, quite near Jerusalem, and they have a population of 37,000, just east of Jerusalem, and they have all the trappings of a major city: shopping malls, schools, recreation centre, and a mayor. They're not going anywhere, basically. Others are much smaller, with only a few hundred people. That's not just the unrecognised outposts, but size of the recognised ones as well can be very small in rural areas. Just a picture of an example of Ma'ale Adumim, what it looks like, swimming pools. You wouldn't see that in Palestinian villages or towns. There's where it is, and there's indication of what Palestinian villages were taken over to make room for this settlement. So talking about the settlements, illegal under international law, as per the 4th Geneva Convention 1949, prohibits the occupier from moving its population into the territory it occupies by war, which is what happened basically in 1967. It states that any occupation must be only temporary, and give you all those. The 4th Geneva Convention, although it was signed in 1949, was reconfirmed by all those international organisations there, and there have been numerous UN resolutions since then restating how the settlements are illegal in West Bank, as I'm talking about, but also East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights in Syria. And the UN Security Council resolutions as well reaffirmed this. So there's no shortage of international precedent for saying these statements. Most of you probably would have seen this map, but it's just to give some context about the settlements, really. So that's where we're at in the present day, roughly, and how the green is Palestinian territory, and how it's been broken up by the settlements and the roads and the Israeli infrastructure and the the fact that most of that area is governed by Israel, not Palestinian authorities, etc. Some have called these islands of Palestinian population and authority Bantustans, with recognition that it's similar in some ways to the South African apartheid. Okay, so going to the outposts I mentioned, one I saw here on the way through. A lot of these pictures were taken while we were just driving through, so they may not be the best quality, but you can kind of see that you've got a few caravans up here, and they've been there maybe for only a year or two, and that there's lots of these dotted around the West Bank. In this case, it was just one big family with 7 caravans. They're supplied by, as you can see, all the infrastructure and utilities by Israel. So that's how all the big ones would have started originally, and progressively get bigger and bigger. I've just given a few titles to different types of settlement that I saw going through. So this one is a small, although it's not an outpost, it's official, as it were, settlement. It's a small one, one of the pioneers, as you might say, and you know, they have vineyards. All this land will be settlement, so-called settlement land, making their livings on the Palestinian territory with their vineyards growing there, which is where Palestinian farmers would have been grazing their animals before. Then, to give a contrast, the bigger ones you can see, I'm not sure whether this was Mali El Damim or another similar big one, but pretty, you know, big houses. You can see for yourself what it's like. And that is Mali El Damim, a major city. I just caught a glimpse of some Israeli soldiers there, and just obviously the city on the top there, but you know how stark it is that you're in Palestinian Arabic territory, and the signs are just in English or Hebrew. Well, Hebrew in this case. Sometimes Hebrew first, English second, no Arabic. So another feature of the settlements is the diversion. So I mentioned about ability to travel, how it affects Palestinian locals. This was originally not a long way to go. This was a place called El Azariah, and there used to be a route through for Palestinians to get through, but that's been cut off by the settlements, checkpoints, etc. And now there's this really long, winding desert road. Takes a lot longer to get anywhere, basically. I just, you know, slightly glib, but putting in a few thoughts, how striking this is, that it's Palestinian internationally recognised land, and there's 800,000 settlers and 500 illegal cities or towns, where, you know, it seems like you're in the Wild West, basically. So, colonial life. This is what you see as you're driving around the West Bank. The sort of mixture. In this case, we're on a shared Israeli and Palestinian road, but you have, and there would have been a settlement behind here. So you have the bus stops serving them. You have the bollards protecting them for the bus stop, and obviously the army close by in case. I mean, in terms of safety, there is a reason for this. It's not just theoretical. You know, there have been cases of settlers being mown down by Palestinian people driving. Again, quite near this bus stop there, you can see the bollards for protection, but obviously Israeli flags flying around there. Okay, so just swiftly going on for time. Hebron, in the south of the West Bank. This is an impressive flag, obviously, and it is coming in towards Hebron. It's not actually, you're not quite yet in the outskirts of it. It's a town called Dura, which is sort of not far from there, but it was my first experience of coming into a major city towards Hebron. So it's the largest city in the West Bank and the second largest in the Palestinian territories after Gaza City. And population is about 220,000 Palestinians and 800 roughly Jewish settlers who are concentrated around the old city, who I'll talk about that in a minute. It's the only settlement in the West Bank that is located actually within the city itself. So just a little bit of background historically or politically, there was an agreement, a so-called agreement, I'm not sure if the Palestinians agreed, but 1997 it was divided into two cities, H1 and H2. 80% of it's H1, which is Palestinian run or governed and populated. 80% of the area and 20% is under Israeli control. Okay, so when you're coming into the old city, obviously there's ancient buildings and walls and so on. You see these checkpoints. You also see signs here which you can read a bit clearer in this one, which, as I mentioned before, has only got Hebrew and English, no Arabic. That's because they are indicating settlements in that area. Many of you may know of a famous ancient souk or market in old Hebron called Shahada Street. It's very famous and notable because apart from the fact that Hebron has the is the only place where the Israeli settlers are in this old city, they actually took over, as I say, conquered. These are ancient Palestinian buildings that they've just taken and they occupy. This is the old market, the souk, sort of internal part of it. Further behind it, you can get through an Israeli checkpoint at the end, and you go out into the open market, which I'll show you some pictures of as well.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Just 4 weeks ago, on the top of that building there, the machine guns are now pointing down into the market.
Really?
Yeah. It's a machine gun.
This one?
Yes.
Really horrible.
Yeah.
Threatening.
Start.
Right. Start. Thank you. There's so going into the market, the picture here is showing the stall holders, the shop holders, local businessmen. You can see how English sarcasm, bustling and thriving it is not. And there's a reason for that, of course. It wasn't always like this. Again, a typical market day, hardly any people there. That's me. So coming out into the open a bit more, you're greeted with this really quite depressing scene of actually boarded up, shut shops. They're not going to open, for the foreseeable future. Who knows the reasons why they've shut completely? I guess trade is one of them, but that's not the only one. Then you've got passing through the old, ancient centre of the market. This was actually a branch, so this is the way we went up into the other part of the market, and this was a tunnel that comes out the other side into an equally large section, apparently, of that market. Changes of that market, and that is permanently closed off now. The whole other half of it is out of bounds. Okay, so coming out into the open from the other side, we're greeted with this scene, even more depressing. You know, it used to be a bustling shopping street, and now it's basically tumbleweed coming down the road, except for, as I say, the Jewish-only cafe at the end of there. And then as you go down that road, you come out into the scene where you will see the Ibrahimi Mosque, which is one of the four most holy sites in Islam in the world. And that's the cafe that I pointed out in the other slide. So right abutting that mosque. Kind of a bit rude, isn't it? So the one I skipped over was just another site. When we were walking through, we happened to come across this organisation, representatives from an organisation who are Scandinavian NGO. I can't remember the name of them. Their role was basically a temporary observer role. There was a massacre in that mosque in '94 by an Israeli terrorist called Baruch Goldstein. I think he killed about 20 Palestinians, and then he was killed himself. They laud him as a hero, the settlers nowadays. But since that uprising or problem, they've had this NGO observing, and they, I guess, tried to keep the peace in some way. In the tense area that it is, obviously. Inside the mosque I went in myself, and it's absolutely beautiful, as you can see. Ancient building. I say, although it's only less than half its original size, because after that massacre in '94, apparently the mosque was divided into two, with the larger proportion being allocated as reallocated, I should say, as a synagogue for the settlers, Jewish-only people, I should say, and this is what's left of the Islamic mosque, but it would have been the whole building before that. You know, for hundreds of years. Perhaps there were other religions that occupied it in the past, but for hundreds of years it was Islamic. Okay, so going swiftly into the overlooking the old city of Hebron, going up the hill, we managed to go and not quite meet, but see the I say illegal colonizers, or settlers as they say in the UN or EU. This is a military post to guard the settlers behind them. So they've also got, apart from the one in the centre, the ancient centre, they've got ones up on the hill as well. And this is the lookout post, or whatever military installation for the IDF to guard the settlers up there. And then sort of counter-provocatively, you might say, to coin a term, in response to this settlement right on the edge of Hebron Old City, this very inspiring NGO called Youth Against Settlements set up, and we were lucky enough to have a look round and meeting with them. They've got this base basically, which is run by volunteers, and that's the guy Issa Amro who founded it and runs the place. And they overlook the city on that side, but on this side you've got the settlement that I just pointed out earlier. And the residents of that settlement some of them are here, so they come up and down the hill into the centre. These you may be able to see that they're not quite normally dressed. They're actually dressed in paramilitary outfit, and they have automatic weapons with them, because it's apparently too dangerous for them to walk around in jeans and a t-shirt. and there's children playing next door, Palestinian I should say children, because there's obviously Palestinian houses all around here as well, right next to it. It's a very stark contrast. Needless to say, the settlement children don't go there or play with them or mix. And that's some of the lovely Palestinian children there, with the amazing view of the lights of the city in the background. Okay, so going on outside Hebron, as I mentioned, I stayed in a village nearby. Another sign of this occupation, in the rural area, these are olive groves as far as the eye can see basically, and this is sort of the edge of the village where I was staying, dotted with other Palestinian villages. This is the wall that has been built, and this is the road, and that apparently demarcates the 1949 armistice line. As you can see, there's probably a few kilometres between the two, so that's just a real graphic example of the annexation of all of that land, which would have been these villages, part of these villages' livelihood until it was annexed and stolen. So the permission, I say permission not granted by the authorities here, because this was, or perhaps a different one. What happened, the reason for this is that they start building on the edge of the village for their relatives or whatever, for a new place to live, and then the Israeli army authorities come and basically tell them to stop because they don't have permission. So you see these dotted around as well, like half finished or only just started buildings.
Patrick,
yeah,
we've got maybe like one more minute.
one more minute.
Before we need to go on to Helen.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I will try and whiz through then. So Nablus is in the north. This is just images I'll whiz through for the last minute. Beautiful city, only Palestinians, no settlers, and that's the view from the top. And that is Askar refugee camp, which you can see from the top, and that's inside the refugee camp, pretty miserable, I think. Bedouin settlements, very interesting to see. As you're just passing in the desert, this is Israeli-built road, just whizzing past it, but they would have been there before that. Gosh, this is the second half, but resistance. That's memorials to teenagers who resisted. Only the week before I was there, he was shot and killed. And images of resistance on the wall. You've got Lola Khaled, who was part of the armed resistance in 1960s, and an unknown person on the other side. The Banksy Waldorf Hotel. This is in Bethlehem, by the way. Sorry. Very interesting and iconic. That's me by the wall. Okay, into Ramallah, and this is the Yasser Arafat Museum that I went to. Beautiful place, very interesting inside, and that's his tomb. And that is Mahmoud Abbas's new palace, which he just had built for himself. Maybe not resistance. However, that's maybe more resistance represented there with Nelson Mandela, who visited there. And local village, that's somebody doing some writing on the wall, Free Palestine, and making a reference to Radiohead, who played here in Glastonbury last year and in Tel Aviv before that. In fact, while we were there, they played in Tel Aviv, crossing the cultural picket line, I should say. And whilst we were there, the person from Radiohead, lead singer, said in response to appeals for him not to go to Tel Aviv, a lot was said about this, but in the end we played some music, so it's fine.
Thank you.
And that's Leaving Via Israel. Green green trees, which are actually European pines, which don't belong there because it's not the native crop. And that's Ben Gurion Airport with a nice water feature coming down the roof. And that's the coast of Tel Aviv there. And that, how was your trip? That just says the over 5 million Palestinian refugees are curious because they can't go. And that's it.
Thank you.